Okay, it is 2 o'clock here, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar series. Hello, everybody. My name is Lucas Hartman from the Van Buren Conservation District, and I'd like to welcome you to our third Backyard Symposium. This week-long series is designed to help landowners of all sizes bring their yards to life as a beautiful, sustainable part of our environment. From backyards and lots in urban areas to rural homesteads, green space is beneficial for our mental and physical health and for the animals and plants we share our space with. Through this series, we're hoping you can learn actionable, approachable ways to make your space a bit greener. In the chat, please introduce yourselves and share what you would like to learn today, and feel free to interact there throughout the presentation. By default, all attendees are muted with cameras off. This allows us to record these presentations to be uploaded on our YouTube channel for those who couldn't join us today. So again, welcome to the Backyard Symposium webinar series. You can message us at any time during the presentation or afterwards using the contact form on our website. That's vanburencd.org. And you can also sign up for our newsletter there using the subscribe option at the bottom of the web page. This webinar is being recorded, and all recorded webinars are going to be posted and available at our YouTube channel next week. So that's youtube.com/user/vanburencd/videos. Also follow us on Facebook at Van Buren CD and Instagram at VBCDMI. Live captioning has been made available for this webinar, and we'd like to talk a little bit about how to ask questions during the presentation. So you can do that using the Q&A icon to submit a question to the presenter. Type your question in the box and click the send button. Questions will be asked by the moderator, that's myself, at the end of the presentation. And you can also use the chat to reach out for any help during the webinars. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our topic and speaker for the day. The name of the presentation is Why Should I Manage My Forest by Jeff Steinkraus. Jeff Steinkraus has been serving Michigan and Indiana residents since 1995 and is the owner of Steinkraus Forest Management, LLC. Among other certifications, Jeff is Michigan Registered Forester, Certified Tree Farm Inspector, and a technical service provider for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He helps clients construct timber management plans, establish new plantings, enhance wildlife habitat, among many other things. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Jeff for his presentation today.
See that, or do I still need to click on something?
Make sure you choose the correct screen there with your presentation. You can do that using the new share option.
We had it to work there a minute ago. All right, there we go. Back to Zoom.
Yep, at the bottom you should just see share screen. So if you have your presentation up in a window, hit share screen and you should see your presentation in one of the available windows.
Sorry about that. Well, that.
There we go. Looks good.
I'm much better in the woods.
Okay, so the floor is all yours, Jeff. Go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks, Lucas. So I grew up on a dairy farm in Gladwin, Michigan, and decided that I didn't want to take care of cows the rest of my life. Though I enjoyed it, I didn't enjoy it that much to be out milking cows twice a day. So I thought forestry sounded pretty interesting. I didn't know what a forester was, but I set off to Michigan Tech to find out what forestry was all about. And my last year of college, I decided consulting forester sounded like the best match for my personality and my background to that point. And first couple of years out of college, though, the first job I had was working for the power company and planting trees to be trimmed away from the lines. That got old pretty quick. Then I started working for Bruce Wakeland in Culver, Indiana, with the idea he was going to put me up here in the Dowagiac area. And so we did that in 1995 and have enjoyed working in this area ever since. So today I just want to talk about if you have a woodlot, why should you manage it? I happen to own 9 acres of my own, and then we planted 6 acres of trees through the CRP program handled through the Farm Service Agency. And we've been on this property for 20 years. So we'll talk a little bit about management plan and then a little bit about forest economics. And I'll share a little story towards the end on some choices that I made at the beginning of owning this property and how it's paid off. So as a consulting forester, my job is to meet with landowners, evaluate the property, find out what their goals and objectives are, and try and come up with a plan to manage the property for what their goals and objectives are.
Jeff, can I interrupt you for just a moment? Are you still on the first slide or have you moved a bit further into the presentation?
Still on the first slide.
Okay, just making sure we're on the right screen here. Looks good. Carry on.
Thank you. So when you manage a property, it's best to have a plan to know what you have, where you're going. Quite often we do informal plans where we meet with landowner, come up with a plan and implement that plan. Depending on the size of the property, if it's only a couple acres or 10 acres, all the same, there's probably not much need for a formal written management plan. However, it's still good to have a plan, and that would be by meeting with a professional. They could walk through it with you, tell you what you have. It doesn't have to be a consultant necessarily. Some timber buyers have foresters on staff. And then of course there's, if wildlife is more important, then there's wildlife biologists that might be a better fit for you. So I'm going to talk more about forest management since that's what I do, but I just wanted to mention there are other options. So I am a technical service provider through the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, right there in Paw for Van Buren County, but every county has an office. So as a technical service provider, it's basically a partnership with the NRCS. That's one form of getting some cost share money for a management plan. And then if there's things to do in the plan, there are some cost shareable practices that you can apply for after the plan is finished. So some common goals and objectives for plans or for landowners are wildlife habitat, recreational. They want the woods to look nice. Some people want a healthy and productive woods. Some people just want to pass on good conservation. Some people want to leave their legacy onto their next generation. And quite often, a lot want to manage their woods for economic return. They want to make a little bit of money, at least to help pay the property taxes, if not to try and be as economically viable as possible. So here's a picture of a management plan for my own property. I guess it's never too late. I just did this last year after owning it for 20 years. It was always in my mind, but my wife didn't necessarily know what the plan was, so it was probably time to write a management plan just so it's down in writing. We have about 9 acres in the main woods in Unit 1. And then the tree planting is 6.5 acres. This was a cornfield that we planted to trees in 2001. We built the house in 2002. And I've had some miscellaneous other trees here and there that I've stuck in the ground, and those are towards the middle of the property. So I just want to kind of show, if you were having a management plan written, we would walk the property with you, evaluate what kind of trees there are. We would just decide how many different types of units there would be. I describe the land use history, what kind of forest types there are, what it is currently, and then what's the potential is. A lot of times it's the same, but sometimes if it was an old abandoned field, it's going to potentially develop into something new. So we'll be just, we would, if it was or if we were planting trees, obviously the existing would be a farm field, potential would be a central hardwood mixed deciduous type, if that's what you were planting. And then we talk about some other trees in the understory as well. So that's going to impact what the potential is going to be. Sometimes we need to manage that. Sometimes we just let it go for a while. And we also talk about what size trees there are. The basal area is a measurement of stocking, how well stocked it is. Site quality is going to a lot of times be dependent on the soil type. And then the growth rate, assuming that the trees are growing at the fastest rate possible, you're usually about a 3% volume growth rate. Then we'll make comments about the timber quality, anything that we observe as far as what the wildlife use is currently. And then I typically throw in some history if I know it. Water quality, if there's a nearby pond or creek, we'll want to observe whether there's any erosion problems, as well as any significant natural features. So being a forester, my main objective for my woods is timber production, but I also like to hunt. So wildlife management is also part of that. Of course, in this part of the state, you don't have to do much and you're going to have wildlife. So I don't do anything out of the ordinary other than periodic timber harvests, which allows some younger trees to start growing, which allows different types of habitat, especially for deer browse. And then I put a picture in there of a trail that we planted, and the trees that we planted, we made this trail, or the distance between these two trees nice and wide so we could have a good cross-country trail and walking trail. This particular spot, my daughter got married here last spring, so that was fun. That we got to have an activity here right on our own property. So talking about economic return, since quite a few people are interested in that. We try and grow trees as fast as possible. We try to grow as much volume per acre that makes sense. We want to grow the most valuable crop that you can. Typically, it's going to be black walnut if it's capable of growing walnut, then white oak, sugar maple. Those would be the top 3 at the moment. Cherry used to be up towards the top, and now it's towards the bottom. Walnut's pretty much traditionally been towards the top for the last 50 years, and hopefully will remain near the top. So it's important then to take out the trees that are competing with your best trees, and a lot of times you can sell those if it's at the sellable size. If it's too young, then you would just physically take them out either for firewood or just let them girdle them and let them fall, or cut them down completely in order to make sure the best trees have room to grow. So thinning it to the right stocking level is important. If you leave it too tight, a lot of times it's going to stagnate. If you let it die out on its own, typically the poor quality trees, the biggest and branchiest trees might be the ones that win, and it might not be the best quality tree, or it might be a tree that you really don't want, such as a lower value tree that's going to be competing with your high value trees. So it's important. It's probably going to take a forester to know what the right spacing is for you and for your wood lot. Different trees need different spacing requirements, and that's all important to know. So you're kind of stuck with the soil type that you have, but knowing which trees to have there, which trees are going to thrive there is important. Things like drainage is important. How much sun does the forest have? At different times, you want the trees to be tight together so they're shading their lower limbs, which is going to give you better quality in the long run. Typically, a better quality tree, straight and tall with no limbs, is going to be the highest economic value. It's going to give you the highest grade when you're selling trees. Typically, we don't replant after a harvest. It's typically regenerates on its own. So if you have a woods that doesn't have the trees you think should be there, then you might want to replant after you have an opening after a harvest. Trees such as red maple or silver maple, they can grow on wet ground or high ground. And different types of oaks will grow well on low grounds, such as swamp white oak, bur oak. They will do okay on high ground, but typically black oak or white oak or red oak will be on the high ground. So the history makes a difference. How is the woods managed? If it was managed by man or managed by animals, a lot of the woods in this Southwest Michigan, northern Indiana were grazed. Almost every woods has a fence around it, and that was usually to keep the cows in, but not out. Sometimes there were a few woods that I've come across where there wasn't any livestock. And typically those woods are better than the ones that were grazed. And of course, the deer population now is pretty high, so that almost has the effects of a pasture, and the fact that they pick on certain trees to eat, which is typically the oaks and the maples, and they eat the acorns. So it makes it hard to regenerate oak in particular with the deer population be high. And then man can have an influence, good or bad. Sometimes if the person sold only the good quality trees and left the poor quality trees behind, then you get stuck with a woods full of low value, poor quality trees. And that is referred to as high grading, where you just take the best trees and leave the rest. It could be overcutting, where you cut it too hard and then the trees that come back are scattered, have a lot of limbs. Sometimes that's from greed, just trying to get a good price now and who cares about the future. Sometimes a lack of cutting is also a problem. The forest is not staying the same. It's changing every year. If you like the way it looks now, sometimes you have to do something to try and keep it more or less the way it is. If it is growing into different categories, as far as the more the canopy tightens up, you get less light down to the bottom to the forest floor. Sometimes that gives more of a park-like look. However, it's not always good for regenerating the next crop of trees. So talked a little bit already about the livestock damage. The compaction of the feeder roots around the bases of the trees can, especially beech and maple, are real sensitive, but I've seen it quite a bit on oaks as well, where the tree will become hollow at the base. woods that are heavily pastured in the past. A lot of times we'll have a lot of hawthorn, honey locust. Also, walnut and hickory are fairly tolerant of the cattle. So if you come across a spot with a lot of walnut trees, it could be that it was pastured in the past. And then typically there isn't many young trees in the understory because everything was browse that was chewed on or rubbed on. So you have the big trees and then nothing underneath. Even this could take many years to fix because sometimes just that lack of young trees, the compaction from the cows or pigs or horses, whatever was in there, just takes a long time for that to recover following heavy grazing. Some people like maple syrup. However, the process of tapping trees, you can make more money on maple syrup probably. However, you just have to know that there is a defect in the lumber from that tap. There'll be a staining besides the physical hole from the drilled hole in the maple trees. And then this past summer, we've had a lot of storm damage. It seems like every year there's some storm somewhere. But sometimes you can salvage those trees. If they're not salvaged, you just have to know sometimes they'll have wounds or defects or cracks that you have to be aware of. And then something always on the horizon is exotics and invasive species. The insect world, we lost all of our ash pretty much from the emerald ash borer. Gypsy moth has been bad the last couple of years. Hopefully that's due to collapse on its own. And then disease has been around for a long time. Chestnut blight, it's been around forever. Not many chestnuts left anymore, if any. I just know of a couple. And then Dutch elm disease still affects the red and American elm to varying degrees. Sometimes they can get to be full-size trees, but most of the time they'll die either before they even become a merchantable tree or shortly thereafter. And then the plants, honeysuckle, Asian bush honeysuckle, tree of heaven or ailanthus, common or glossy buckthorn, and probably a newest one that I've been seeing a lot lately is oriental bittersweet vine. I saw very little of that 20 years ago, and now it seems like it's popping up everywhere. So when thinking about a harvest, we want to pick trees to take out of the woods that are either at their peak in value and ones that are, we want to make sure we leave the ones that have potential to continue to grow. So if a tree like elm is large enough to sell now, but I know it's going to die from the Dutch elm disease, there's a very high chance I would mark that. Unless the landowner likes morel mushrooms, then I might leave that tree and let it die naturally, since a recently killed elm tree is usually a good spot for morel mushrooms. So that's a question I would for sure ask the landowner and let them decide what they want to do. But from growing that tree to, typically we look at doing a harvest about every 10 years. So if I didn't think that tree is likely to make it for 10 more years, then that's one I would include in a harvest. If you only had one particular species of a tree, I would likely leave that tree for the hopes that it would regenerate. And that's particularly true of an oak tree. I wouldn't want to take out the last oak tree out of the woods because that's good for wildlife as well as timber. But I would hope to use that at least to help with the chances of regenerating the oak. So as a forester, we're looking at a balance of a lot of things. Trying to keep the species mix, trying to keep the growth rate going, and try to grow the best quality trees as possible. typically trees such as maple, walnut, white oak. They're going to be broken down into veneer grade, prime grade or number 1 grade, number 2 grade, and then pallet. For anything less than about 12 inches in diameter at chest height, we don't have a market for that. That would, up north, that would be called pulpwood. Down here, we just don't have a pulpwood market. So that's why we have to just deal with that through forest and improvement work, firewood, but there's not even a firewood market. So pretty much we think of that as no value for anything less than 12 inches. I should say no current value. Some of the species that are the highest value: walnut, cherry, sugar maple. Well, cherry is not high anymore. It used to be high, but now it's near the bottom, at least hopefully short term. But it used to be number 2 for quite a long time. And then red and white oak. Medium would be bur oak, tulip, soft maple, red elm. Low value, pretty much always cottonwood. Willow's usually not even a commercial species. American elm, sycamore, beech, hickory. Even though hickory cabinets are one of the most expensive cabinets you can buy, it's not because of the value, it's because of the hardness of the wood and how hard it is to work with as they're trying to make furniture or cabinets out of it. So cottonwood does grow fast. So does tulip and sycamore. Red or silver maple grow fast, which is what I would call them soft here. And black cherry is pretty fast growing. Walnut can be really slow growing, but if it's on a good soil type, it can grow medium to fast. Red oak is a pretty fast growing in some soils and medium on others. And ash is no more. White oak and sugar maple are traditionally slow, and hickory is even slower. So if you have woods full of hickory and you want to grow trees fast, you might want to sell some trees, sell some of the hickory and make room for something else. However, if you like squirrels, and the hickory nuts will be good for that. So you might want to keep at least some of the hickory for the squirrels. So on the volume, trees are getting bigger in diameter every year. A lot of times they're also getting more height, unless there's a fork or damage in the tree at some point. They'll get usually more usable lumber out of a tree as the tree gets larger, unless, like I say, there's a major fork in the tree, and then you're only going to gain more or less of volume in the diameter and not so much in the height. But if it has the potential to continue to gain more height, then we consider that still a tree that's growing in volume. So something like black cherry is a pretty, I would say, weak-rooted tree. It's also one of the first ones to leaf out in the spring, so it's collecting a lot of the wind in the spring, and it's therefore subject to more uprooting. So that's something to be considered when you're looking at. You typically don't want to leave a cherry tree isolated in the woods after harvest, otherwise it's likely to blow over. And you might not let that tree last until it's really large, otherwise it's going to continue to be at risk to blow over. And some trees seem to be programmed to grow faster and better. We would say that's more genetics. Sometimes they tend to grow more branchy, more limbs, and that's not something that you really want to reproduce. So poor quality trees, typically we would focus on taking out. So woodlands are a very valuable asset, not only for looking at and enjoying, but they can also be as competitive as common farm ground, not necessarily irrigated land, but if you consider all the inputs that farmers have to put into their croplands, woodlands can be a pretty valuable asset if it's managed properly. So the other thing to remember is to make sure that if it has a potential, such as let's say a walnut tree that's 14 inches in diameter, very tall and straight. So that one's not going to be veneer quality or even #1 quality just because of the size. So by letting that tree go another 10 or 20 years, it's likely going to continue to jump in grade, which is going to drastically improve the value on a walnut tree. Other trees, the veneer to saw log isn't quite as dramatic, but it can be 7 times as much on a walnut tree from veneer to saw log grade. So something to be considered. So typically, average woods was going to be making 4 or 5% per year. So that's a little better than inflation. And it's pretty stable, other than some storms or insect or disease problems. Most trees are fairly resistant to most of that. So it makes it a pretty valuable investment. Plus you get to enjoy it along the way. So I was talking about the percent grade and change. That's average just in a regular grade change. But if it's jumping from saw log to veneer, that one will be very much different. So some management practices that we commonly do. Yesterday we spent the day in the woods up by Hastings cutting wild grapevines that were choking out trees in the woods. Doing commercials, I guess we'll call that a weeding of the garden, a weeding of the woods. Some sales, quite a few sales actually. We start with trying to get rid of the poor quality stuff first. We'll call that an improvement sale or basically almost a pallet sale. We're just picking out poor quality, low value trees with the hopes that it'll regenerate to better stuff. You have to have the better stuff out there. Otherwise, you might want to think about replanting a few trees in the woods. Forest stand improvement or timber stand improvement. That would be something like if you have an elm tree right next to a walnut tree. The walnut tree is by far more valuable than the elm tree, so we would recommend taking that out. Tree planting, if you have a crop field, you could plant that to trees using a program through the Farm Service Agency called the Conservation Reserve Program. It's a little more difficult to get good quality trees established in your woods. You probably would need to use tree tubes or a fence in order to keep the deer from eating them. But we have done that on occasion, especially if the landowner wants more oak or walnut in the woods where there isn't any, then you have to introduce it. It's probably not going to come naturally. So as we try and maximize the value of your woods, you want to make sure you keep your potential, the ones that are going to keep in growing. You don't want to sell them. You don't want to cash them in early. It'd be like cashing in your savings bonds before it had a chance to mature. A lot of times dead trees still could be sold. Definitely damaged or defective trees, so long as they're not too far gone, as far as they still have to have some usable wood in them. We'd always focus on the high risk trees, poor quality trees, poor value, poor mature trees, trees that aren't growing very fast. If your goal is to faster growth in the woods. And then there's economic maturity and biological maturity. If the tree dies, that's biologically mature. Somewhat dependent on the species, but economic mature tree would be probably somewhere around 24 inches in diameter on a lot of species. But sometimes we're going to sell them younger than that in order to thin out the forest to keep the best trees growing. So there's a picture of a dead tree marked for harvest. This summer I saw too much of these uprooted trees, but these trees still have damage to a point. If they're not cracked, which a lot of times a tree like this will still have the roots attached and then the top attached, so it could be perfectly green still. In fact, this one still had green leaves on it. So this picture here is of a pin oak, and even black oak. A lot of times they'll hold their lower limbs, which is a defect. Red oak will have a straighter bole, sheds its lower limbs quicker naturally, and therefore makes it a better quality, higher value species. This picture on the right shows a big cavity. So sometimes these trees are left if the landowner's primary objective is wildlife management, because it provides a nesting cavity for some wildlife, some small mammals, birds. Not all holes are created equal. There's better ones than others. And if that tree is at risk of snapping off in half right there, then that's also something to consider whether that's the best one, depending on what the use of the whole forest is. So here's a picture if you were going to sell some trees. We typically do a sealed bid type sale. And we would mark the trees, paint the trees, provide a listing to the timber buyer. Total number of trees by species, and our estimation on how many board feet are in the tree. A board foot is a 1 inch wide board, 1 inch thick board, 12 inches wide, 12 inches long. So that's how many board feet would be in the tree after the limb, after the bark is off and the log is milled. We sell the trees standing, so this is just an estimate. Sometimes the trees are hollow or cracked or something that we don't notice when we're marking it. But this gives the little timber buyers basically an idea of what size trees there are out there. But we have a set day and time for the sale, where the woods is located. And then typically on a sale, we would get 5 to 6 bids. It gets mailed out to over 40 on my list. And then, but there's usually 3 or 4 people, 5 people maybe that would be interested in quite a few of the sales we put up. Another thing I've seen in the past is poor contracts for people that didn't know what they were signing. So it's important to make sure that you have a good contract, that everything that somebody says to you is put down in writing. I've seen the worst contract I think I've ever seen was a landowner sign a contract with a timber buyer that said he was interested in 20 or 30 trees, but the contract said all usable timber over 16 inches in diameter. And it didn't say where the 16 inches in diameter was measured. So at the stump, 16 inches in diameter is about 12 inches at chest height. So pretty much they signed a contract that the timber buyer could take pretty much all the trees on their property. That was not what was talked about. However, they signed the contract and it was hard for them to get out of that. So I don't say that to scare anybody. However, hopefully that won't be something that happens very often. So you want to make sure that you are not responsible if somebody gets hurt when they're cutting the trees. Contract should always have a deadline, a reasonable deadline. This spring, I'm going to be given some extension because of the muddy winter that we've had. People are going to need a longer time to get some of those woods done that they've been hoping to get done, but the weather hasn't cooperated. And then typically we would ask the timber buyer to make a 25% down payment and then full payment before they start cutting anything. Then you need to tell them how they're going to access it, whether it's through the field or driveway or however. And then, like I say, we mark the trees with paint so everybody knows what they're bidding on, and we can mark that on the contract as well. There's always a wide range in prices when we do these seal bid type sales. So this slide just kind of talks about on this first one, the low bid was 58% of what the high bid was. And this one was 48%, this one was 50%. And on any given day, this one it was 15%. 50% might have been the high bidder of the next sale. So we never know what somebody needs, what they want. Different mills typically focus on different species. That's part of it. The timing is always a factor, access, all those things kind of factor in, the quality, types of trees. So I would say always work with a consultant if you can, but for sure a reputable buyer. Have a written contract, and timber is typically considered long-term capital gains and not ordinary income. So that's important. And if you just purchase the property, sometimes you can choose to deplete your basis over time rather than paying as much tax now. Eventually it will catch up to you, but it's something to talk about with an accountant. And a website that talks about it more is timbertax.org, or Michigan State University or Purdue University also has information on taxes. So the main things, do you have a plan in your mind of what you want to do? And if you need some help, we're available to help with that. And make sure you sell to a big company. Don't sell to the first person that knocks on your door. Don't let them pick which trees they want to buy. Typically, they're going to want to buy the best and leave you with the rest. And if you got some young trees that are getting close to jumping up in grade, you want to make sure you're not selling that potential value. So in our property, we bought in I said 1990. That was 1999, sorry. The 9 acres of woods and 11 acres of field. I measured all the trees in this woods larger than 12 inches, 330 trees, 37,000 board feet. Estimated value if I was to clear cut it right then would have been $17,200. Instead, I chose to sell 80 trees in 2002. We got 3 bids, 3,400, 3,300, and $2,050. Then 2004, we had 11 trees up ready to storm, which I mostly got a few for lumber and firewood. I figured that value was about $500. And then I re-inventoried it in 2007, had 295 trees with $38,662, which value jumped up to $28,654. How did that happen? There was quite a bit of walnut trees in the woods that were growing, and they were getting larger, plus the value of walnut went up in that time frame. So in this first sale, the $3,400 sale was red elm that were starting to die. Some larger trees on the edges and a few basswood and sugar maple. So just that change in value had gained $14,900, which is not bad for that time frame. And then in 2019, I sold 21 trees. 8 of these were walnuts that had jumped up into the veneer category, one of which had been hit by lightning. A few other ones were wind blown, I think. So I was getting nervous and decided we better sell some of those. I thought the sale was going to bring about 15,000, and we got 19,000. And 2 bids were at my estimate of 15, and then 2 others were below that. So had I had sold the walnut trees at the beginning, we wouldn't have this value. So I just thought that was interesting to see what the difference would have been had we sold the walnut right away. It could have helped pay for part of the property, but I'm glad that we were able to go ahead and wait for those to mature. And I still have some walnut out in the woods. Still looks like a woods egg even after this harvest. And the next sale will be again about 2029. So, Lucas, are there any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. That was really informative. We do have a few questions in the chat. And I do want to remind everybody that you can continue to ask questions here. We've got about 15 more minutes before we're going to close this session. So please feel free to ask those in the chat or using the Q&A function. You can find those at the bottom of your screen here. So Jeff, leave your contact information up there while we go through a couple of these. Okay. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right. The first one talks about the role of kind of longer, narrower corridors of woodlots. These might be things like fence rows, windrows on a field edge, or maybe a riparian buffer, and their role in providing habitat, microbiomes, cooling nearby crops, and reducing desertification. What are some good techniques on managing these more narrow corridors? Is there any potential profit? And are there any sort of penalties that you're aware of in any of the federal programs for removing these?
I don't believe there's any penalties for removing them. If you remember the Dust Bowl years, I think there's a definite benefit to having fence rows. Of course, not all fence rows or windbreaks are created equal. Some are better designed than others. Something like black cherry pops up in a lot of fence rows, so it would have some bird habitat for sure. Would also provide some windbreak, but also be subject to blowing over, being that it's shallow rooted. And sometimes conifer windbreaks work better actually than some hardwoods. They do definitely provide habitat for birds. The risk would of course be limbs and stuff landing in the farmers' fields, which they don't care for. But there has been some proof that it does improve productivity and prevents soil erosion for sure. Some of the newer farming techniques as far as putting cover crops on definitely helps mitigate some of those areas where there aren't any fence rows left. But I think we have less pheasants and other things because we don't have as many fence rows, especially right here in Cass County for sure.
All right, fantastic. All right, we got another one here. The question is, part of my property that was once farmed has now come up with a lot of tulip poplar. Are there any suggestions on management for that? Historically, this was an oak hickory forest, and I'm guessing the person answering this question might want to return to that if possible.
So depends on how quick you want to convert it back. The tulip being tall and fast growing can be a good tree as far as timber production. It's be in the medium categories for value, but in the high category for speed of growth. It would almost be a site visit kind of a determination as far as to see if they're any oak or hickory nearby that would help repopulate the area if it was harvested. If it's fairly young yet, you could set back the tulip and try and plant some oak and hickory in there. However, those are typically, especially white oak and hickory, are a lot of times come in later. There would be more of a second generation tree that would seed in on its own.
All righty. All right, another one coming in here. This should be a quick one for you. What's your estimate of the value in the market of veneer quality red oak at the current time?
The red oak is less than other ones. The value, it's hard to say, because we don't split it out by species all that much. Red oak is lower than it's been for several years. It's been low for several years. Probably standing in the woods and then be in the 50 to 60 cent per board foot range.
Okay.
But again, you'd want to talk to those that are more competitive on the red oak markets to find out for sure.
Awesome. Here's an interesting one I don't think we've discussed before. What kind of percentage or commission or fees from the timber sale does a forester take or a consultant take?
So our typical fee is 8% to oversee the sale. If we get more involved as far as in the logging inspection, we might be up to 10%. Other consultants might charge a flat fee based pretty much on time or materials. And then other consultant, I'm not sure what other consultants charge.
Okay. Here's a good one too. We haven't talked about this yet either. What do we do with all the stumps that are left behind?
So some stumps will resprout and actually become a next generation of trees. That's usually not the best tree, but sometimes it's good enough. A lot of times there'll be multiple sprouts that will come off of the stump. The smaller the stump, the more likely the sprouts will be viable. Sometimes it's just pops up for the short term. But eventually they'll decay if they're not going to sprout and becomes a good habitat. But nothing has to be done with stumps in the woods.
Okay. But I'm sure as a consultant or other companies, they might provide or buyers might provide grinding or something like that of the stumps if maybe the area is going to be used for a trail system or something like that after the harvest.
So most of the loggers don't have any kind of stump grinding. So you might have to find more like an excavator or something if you're trying to develop trails that's going to be in your way, or some of those like a pecan head on a skid loader now can do some grinding.
Okay.
Otherwise, if it's not in your way, then there's nothing wrong with leaving them.
Fantastic.
And the same happens pretty much with the treetops. A lot of times, if no one's going to use them for firewood, it's actually a good spot for new seedlings to grow up through the trees where the deer typically don't get in and fight their way in to eat the seedlings that might be coming up through the treetop. So it's kind of like a living natural fence.
Yeah, that's great. I like that idea. Okay, we've got one more here about going back to talking about forest management plans. Can you shed a little bit of light on the longevity of a plan and how often you should have it updated and those sorts of things?
So a plan typically would be written for a 10-year window, especially through NRCS. There's also a tax program called the Qualified Forest Program that only has a 10-year max, and then it has to be updated every 10 years. I would say most of the time 10 years is about the right time. That way you can anticipate if there's any new insect or disease problems or forest health in general. But it can be adaptive too. If it's more of a informal plan, then just checking on your woods every 5 to 10 years would be good, unless you notice something drastically changing, then it should be quicker. Also monitoring for invasive species. You don't want to wait 10 years before you're checking your woods for stuff like autumn olive or honeysuckle or this bittersweet vine. You want to be out pretty much every year looking for new hotspots, because it's a whole lot easier and cheaper to take care of it when you find it than when it becomes overwhelming and hinders the tree that you're trying to grow.
Awesome. Sounds good. And we've got one more question here, a sort of an interesting one we've got from a participant that says that they've sold carbon credits in the past, and if you have any information on the pricing of these, or if you're familiar with this process.
So actually, I sold carbon on my 6-acre tree planting when I first did it. It was quick and easy, filled out a form. I think I got $4 a ton or something like that. It came out to about $400, something like that, for 5 or 6 years worth of a brand new planting. So that wasn't too bad. Currently, it has to be a woods, at least 40 acres or more, I believe. I've been watching the newest and latest. I don't think our area is typically going to qualify, at least not in the short term. Somewhere in the $8 per ton to $15 is what I've seen recently.
Okay.
And as far as the value goes, it's kind of the Wild West right now. There's several companies trying to figure it out. As far as the typical woodland, traditionally the largest forest owners are going to be able to participate now. There was a company that was trying to get smaller acreages signed up. That was under the NCX, and their processes didn't get approved, so they're back to the drawing board trying to get that figured out. So at the moment, I don't have any recommendations. I can put you in touch with Mike Small again from the DNR. He's the one that's done a lot of research on it, especially for private landowners. And he's got a lot of information on it.
All right, fantastic. Well, that's all I'm seeing for questions in the webinar today. And so if we collect any more, again, folks, you can reach out to us at our webpage and using the contact form and ask us some questions. You could also reach out to Jeff directly, or we can put the two of you together. So don't feel like your time is up for getting any of your questions answered here.
And if somebody has a woodland, I'm happy to come out and meet with them one-on-one with their property. Typically our first inspection, we don't charge for, just to get familiar with the property and the landowner. So if you think that would be helpful, you can contact me and we'll be happy to set up an appointment.
Fantastic. Okay, so that's it for today, folks. We'd like to thank everybody for attending the webinar series this week, and we hope that you've got a lot of great information from these different presenters. Thanks again, Jeff, for today's topic of managing forests. Once again, you can message us directly through our contact page on our website. That's vanburencd.org/contact-2, or sign up for our newsletter using the subscribe option at the bottom of our website. And once again, this webinar has been recorded, and so it will be made available to everybody next week at our YouTube page. And that again is youtube.com/user/vanburencd/videos. And follow us on Facebook at vanburencd and Instagram at vbcd.mi for more information about our upcoming events. So that's all for today, everybody. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Lucas.